In the fall of 1989, a graduate student named Emily Graves from Berea College was conducting a thesis project on forgotten Appalachian settlements when she stumbled upon the remains of New Bethany Church, long since consumed by the woods of eastern Kentucky. The building had collapsed decades earlier, but the stone foundation and a few weather-worn pews remained half-buried beneath moss and leaves. She had not come expecting to find anything of value, just sketches, measurements, and perhaps names from tombstones that had long since faded. But beneath a cracked flagstone at the front of what had once been the sanctuary, her boot struck something hollow. Curious, Emily pried the stone loose. Beneath it was a small space dry despite the damp forest, and inside it, wrapped in rotted linen, was a journal bound in cracked brown leather, its spine warped by time. The first page was signed in a formal slanted script, Reverend Isaac Ellery, New Bethany Baptist Church, March 1834. What she found inside would change the course of her research and possibly her life. The entries began like any other pastoral record. Weather, sermons, illnesses among the congregation. But as Emily read on, the tone changed. A chill began to settle over her as the entries grew frantic, obsessive, nearly unhinged. March the 17th. The twins arrived today. Their father is a preacher from Tennessee, but it's the girls. Dear God, it's the girls. March 18th. I buried the cat this morning. They say it choked on a thorn, but Rachel knew it would die. She said she saw the briar in its throat before it happened. March 19th. She told Elder Thatcher about the baby, the one no one knew was his. How can a child know these things? There were dozens of such entries, each more unsettling than the last. March 20th. Rebecca stood at the altar and whispered something I will not repeat. I trembled. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. March 21st. They should have never come here. Emily closed the book and sat in stunned silence, surrounded by crumbling pews and the soft hush of autumn wind. The entries stopped abruptly after March 23rd. No final prayer, no signature. But at the back of the journal, on a torn piece of parchment wedged between pages, someone, likely Reverend Ellery, had scrawled a final line. Some truths are not learned. They are remembered from lives we do not speak of. She returned to the college library and requested access to regional archives. What she found confirmed the church had in fact existed and been abandoned sometime in the late 1830s. No cause was listed, no surviving congregation, no census data. It was as though the place had simply vanished, and of the twins Rebecca and Rachel there was no official record, no birth certificate, no death notice. Just a handful of vague mentions in 2 surviving family Bibles from other counties. Enough to suggest they had once been real, and then were not. The next morning, Emily returned to the site. She brought a field recorder and set it on the stone pulpit. As the wind passed through the hollow, she began to read the entries aloud. But what the recorder captured was not only her voice. In the background, faint but clear, 2 childlike voices could be heard whispering, "Tell them what happened here." March 17, 1834. New Bethany was a quiet fold of humanity nestled deep in the folds of the Cumberland Hills, where the sun barely touched the hollows, and nothing new happened without 3 elders and a scripture proving it. That afternoon, just as the fog was beginning to lift off the mossy cemetery stones, a stranger arrived, tall, dust-covered, and walking beside a creaking wagon drawn by a single bay mule. Elias Monroe, a circuit preacher known to a few by reputation, stepped into the clearing with 2 girls seated in the wagon's rear. They were identical in face, perhaps 9 years old, with long ash-blonde hair, pale skin that seemed untouched by sun, and eyes the color of a cloudless winter sky. One sat cross-legged, whittling a twig with eerie precision. The other simply stared at the gathered onlookers with an intensity that made the eldest men shift uncomfortably. Pastor Isaac Ellery, 46. A rigid man with a mind honed by Calvinist theology and a voice roughened by wilderness sermons, greeted Monroe with polite restraint. "You've traveled far," Ellery said, extending a hand that Monroe clasped firmly. "We don't get many visitors in New Bethany. I don't come by accident, Monroe replied. Sometimes the spirit leads where the road ends. His voice was soft but carried a gravity that demanded stillness. He introduced the girls as Rebecca and Rachel, his daughters, and added that their mother had passed during childbirth in a snowstorm that stranded them for 5 days in the highlands. That night, Monroe and the twins were offered shelter in the loft above the meeting house. The congregation was small, barely 40 people in total, but generous in hospitality. Bread was brought, broth, an extra quilt. Elder Thatcher even lent his only oil lantern to warm the children's bedside. But there was tension beneath the hospitality, especially from the women who noticed that the twins never seemed to blink in unison, never laughed, never asked for anything. When Martha Carter, a midwife and devout woman of no-nonsense temperament, offered to check on the girls, Rachel simply said, "You already buried your own daughter. We're not the ones you should be worried about." Martha froze. Her daughter Mary had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, a fact known only to her husband and the traveling doctor who had delivered the stillborn child under moonlight while neighbors slept. "How did you know?" she began, but Rebecca interrupted, voice flat. "She still waits in the orchard. That's why the peach tree never bloomed again." Martha left without another word, her hands shaking. Pastor Ellery, informed of the exchange, dismissed it as coincidence, paired with cruel imagination. But later, as he passed the window of the church, he saw both twins standing motionless outside in the dark, staring at the peach tree. Neither spoke, neither moved, as if waiting for something only they could hear. That night, Elias Monroe remained by the fireplace in silent prayer. Pastor Ellery approached him uneasy. "Your daughters. They speak strangely, as if they know things no child should." Elias did not look up from the fire. "They dream, but not like others. They see what people hide, what they bury." Ellery stiffened. "You mean secrets? I mean truths," Monroe said quietly, "unspoken ones. Sometimes from the past, sometimes from before the past." That answer disturbed Ellery more than any devilry he could name. The next morning, during breakfast in the communal hall, the twins sat beside their father, eating slowly. Rebecca looked across the table at Elder Thatcher and said, "You hid the belt buckle in the barn rafters, the one from the soldier you buried behind the spring house." The old man dropped his tin cup. The room fell silent. Thatcher had once confessed under threat of excommunication to striking a drifter who'd broken into his smokehouse. He'd claimed the man fled. No body was ever found. But only Thatcher knew about the belt buckle, a Union emblem from the War of 1812 still stained with dried blood. Later that day, when confronted by Ellery, Thatcher denied everything. Yet, when he went to the barn, he found the buckle exactly where the girl had described, wrapped in oilcloth just beneath the rafters. By sundown, the town had turned. Fear, quiet but growing, began to replace welcome. Children were pulled away from the twins. Neighbors whispered during prayer. The midwife crossed herself when she passed Elias on the trail. Still, the twins remained silent until the church service on Sunday morning. It was then, beneath the tall rafters and amidst a sermon on purity, that Rebecca rose, walked to the pulpit, and placed her hand on the wood. "This place was never clean," she said. "There are bones in the floor, and none of them rest." Gasps rippled across the pews. Pastor Ellery slammed his Bible shut. But Rachel only added, calm as rain, "We hear them every night." There was a silence in the church so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air as if the very walls were holding their breath. Pastor Ellery stood frozen behind the pulpit, his hand still resting on the edge of the open Bible, though he could no longer read the words on the page. Rebecca's statement hung over the congregation like smoke. "There are bones in the floor." Rachel, standing at her sister's side, repeated the phrase not louder but clearer, "and none of them rest." For several seconds, no one moved. Then Elder Thatcher rose abruptly, his cane striking the wooden floor like a gunshot. "This is sacrilege," he said, voice trembling with anger, or was it fear? "They're children. Sick children. We shouldn't be listening." But Pastor Ellery noticed something Thatcher didn't realize. The congregation wasn't looking at the twins with disdain or amusement. They were looking at him, because Pastor Isaac Ellery had been in New Bethany for 18 years, longer than any other adult still alive. If someone knew what lay beneath that floor, it would be him. He ended the service early. That night, long after the town had retired into uneasy sleep, Ellery returned to the church, alone, a lantern in hand, and a crowbar wrapped in cloth under his coat. He moved slowly up the aisle, stopping at the very spot where Rebecca had stood. He knelt. The floorboards here were older than the rest, slightly bowed, stained dark with oil and age. He tapped them lightly, hollow. He pulled the crowbar from his coat and began to pry. The first board came up with a reluctant groan, releasing the scent of dry rot and old dust. The second came more easily. Beneath them packed dirt. But when he dug a few inches down with his bare hands, he felt it something hard, smooth. He cleared the earth, revealing the curve of a human skull, discolored with time but unmistakable. Just beside it, the smaller bones of a child's ribcage partially wrapped in what remained of a rotted woolen blanket. Ellery recoiled in horror. He dropped the lantern. The flame flickered dangerously but did not catch. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. He collapsed to his knees, staring at the skeletal remains in disbelief. They were right. The girls were right. But how no one alive knew about the bodies. He'd read every record. There was no mention, no rumors, not even in the dying murmurs of the old folk who'd passed on years before. He replaced the floorboards with shaking hands, barely managing to drive the nails back in. He didn't sleep that night. The next day, Elias Monroe found him seated outside the parsonage, eyes bloodshot, hands caked with dirt. "You looked?" Monroe said simply. Ellery didn't respond. "They don't lie," the preacher continued. "They don't even understand what they see, not really. The dreams come and they speak, that's all." "Why here?" Ellery finally asked, voice hoarse. "Why would they come here?" Monroe looked toward the church. His voice dropped low. "Because something was buried here that was never confessed." By afternoon, rumors were spreading like wildfire. The townspeople had seen the pastor's lantern flickering through the church windows well past midnight. They whispered of digging, of curses of voices in the wind. Martha Carter, the midwife, was the first to confront Ellery. "You knew something, didn't you? You always did." "I knew nothing," Ellery said stiffly, but his voice lacked conviction. That night the congregation met in secret without inviting the Monroes. Some demanded the twins be cast out. Others feared that doing so would provoke whatever spirits they were communing with. The most devout quoted scripture calling the girls vessels of corruption. But a few, particularly the younger members, believed the children were revealing the truth. Justice at last. The town split down the middle, and still the twins said nothing. Until Thursday evening, when Rachel walked into the town square alone and sat beside the old fountain. She sat silently for nearly an hour until a young boy approached her, Jonathan Gray, 12-years-old son of the millwright. He offered her a dried apple and asked quietly, "Is it true about the bones?" Rachel nodded. Jonathan hesitated. Do you know what happened to my brother?" Caleb." Rachel didn't blink. Her voice was like cold water. "He followed the wrong man into the trees. There's a cairn by the North Ridge. The stones are shaped like a triangle." Jonathan ran home in tears. The next morning, accompanied by his father, he found a small burial mound, old, crumbling, covered in lichen. Beneath it were shreds of cloth that matched the shirt Caleb had worn the day he disappeared, 3 years earlier. The town went silent again, but this time it was the silence of dread, not denial. That night, Rebecca whispered to her father as he tucked her into her cot above the church. "More are coming," she said softly. Elias leaned close. "Who?" She looked toward the window, though nothing moved beyond the glass. "The ones who built this place. The ones who made the floor bleed." Pastor Isaac Ellery had always believed he knew the history of New Bethany. He had read the journals, the church records, the letters kept in trunks beneath dry floorboards. The settlement had been founded in 1811 by 4 families who fled persecution in Charleston and sought a place where their interpretation of the scriptures could rule unchallenged. They had chosen these hills because no one else wanted them. Rocky remote surrounded by swamps and wild pine. New Bethany was not a place people arrived at by accident, but that history, the clean biblical version, was beginning to fall apart. And the girls were not telling him new things. They were telling him things he had chosen not to see. He returned to the church crypt the next morning using the iron key passed down from his predecessor, Reverend Hollis. Most believed the crypt was empty, nothing but damp stone and old communion vessels. But behind the far wall, obscured by a panel of carved cedar, Ellery found something he had never dared to examine closely. A sealed wooden crate marked with a date July 3, 1812. The box groaned as he pried it open. Inside were 3 objects. A leather-bound ledger brittle and stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. A silver communion chalice tarnished black around the rim, and a bundle of letters tied with animal sinew. Ellery sat down on the cold stone floor and opened the ledger first. The handwriting was rougher than what he was used to a miner's hand or a tradesman's, but it was unmistakably the writing of Silas Gray, one of the town's 4 founders, and the namesake of half its roads. What the pages contained made Ellery feel like the floor beneath him had shifted. We found him face down in the creek, gold still in his pack. The vote was close 3-1. We buried the body beneath the meeting house, used the silver to finish the roof. Ezra said it would be a sin, said blood money makes cursed ground. But we told him the Lord would forgive if we used it for his house. Besides, no one else was going to find him. It got easier after that. The road was long, the hills dangerous. They disappeared easy. The further Ellery read, the worse it became. There were dozens of entries, each one colder than the last. Travelers, traders, surveyors. Every one of them with coin or tools. Every one of them buried beneath the church or behind the spring house. A method, a system, a quiet little economy of silence and earth. No one ever confessed Silas wrote, but we swore it on the book no one speaks, no matter what comes knocking. The letters in the bundle were no better. One from Ezra Miller, dated 1816, pleaded with his brother in Georgia. I can't bear the dreams anymore. I hear them beneath the floorboards. I see their eyes in the firelight. We told ourselves it was righteous. It wasn't. It was murder dressed in scripture. Ezra Ellery recalled had disappeared in 1817. Drowned, supposedly, but there had never been a funeral. The ledger said otherwise. Ezra talked too much. Buried him beside the German doctor. When Ellery emerged from the crypt 2 hours later, he looked older, his beard grayer, his eyes hollow. He knew now that the girls weren't disturbing the town. They were awakening something the town had already buried alive. That evening, as the wind rose through the hollows and the dogs barked without reason, Rebecca stood beside the fireplace at the boarding house and told Martha Carter your grandmother knew. She helped wash the blood off the stones. Martha slapped her. Hard. The room went still. Rebecca didn't cry. She simply looked down at the woman's hand and said, "It won't wash off this time either." The next morning, 4 horses arrived at the edge of New Bethany. They carried 2 federal riders, an assistant from the Lexington Circuit Court, and a man named Thomas Creed, who claimed to be a land agent but whose coat hid a U.S. Marshal's badge. Creed had received a letter unsigned with no return address. It read only, "The Church of New Bethany is built on the bodies of 13 men. You will find a ledger in the crypt beneath the altar. Signed, a witness." The twins stood in the doorway as the riders approached. Rachel whispered to her sister. Rebecca smiled sadly and replied, "No more secrets now." Thomas Creed was not the kind of man easily spooked. He had ridden through Indian Territory, tracked counterfeiters across the Cumberland Plateau, and once spent a week inside a cave to expose a wagon train ambush scheme. But nothing he had encountered, not war, not crime, not betrayal, felt as cold as the air inside that church. Creed stood beneath the tall beams of New Bethany Baptist Sanctuary, staring at the wooden floor near the altar. "This is the spot," he asked. Pastor Ellery nodded. His voice was low. "Yes, I've seen what's beneath." Creed knelt. "Then let's see it again." The boards groaned as they came up one by one. With every layer removed, the sour smell of mold rot and earth intensified. Then silence. The shovel struck bone. The marshal's assistant, Daniel Price, barely 20 and visibly shaken, helped dig through the packed soil. Within an hour, the partial remains of a man were uncovered, a broken skull, one arm twisted backward and the remnants of a leather boot still clinging to the shin bone. Ellery flinched as he recognized the object tucked beside the skeleton, a rusted iron compass, its glass cracked, but its needles still trembling. "I've seen that before," he whispered. Thomas Creed looked at him sharply. "Where Ezra Miller," Ellery said slowly. "He carried one just like that. Said he never stepped into the woods without it." Creed's face hardened. "Ezra Miller went missing in 1817. Your church records say he drowned." Ellery looked away. "So I believed." Creed didn't speak. He just kept digging. By the end of the day, 12 graves had been uncovered. All male, all adults. Some clearly murdered skulls, crushed ribs shattered. Others perhaps poisoned, strangled, or buried alive. Most had small items still with them: buttons, belt buckles, a locket with initials etched inside JP, and one had a gold ring bearing the emblem of the Virginia Land Survey Office. Creed recognized it instantly. "Joshua Pratt," he said. "A surveyor. Went missing in 1815. He was mapping this area for a proposed railroad route." Rachel and Rebecca stood quietly near the door. They hadn't come inside since the digging began, but as dusk settled, they stepped over the threshold. Thomas Creed turned to them. "There were supposed to be 13, he said. Only 12 here. Where's the last one?" The girls exchanged a glance. Rebecca pointed not to the church floor, but to the pulpit itself. "Behind the altar," she said. "Buried upright. Like he was made to watch." Creed's men removed the altar carefully. Behind it, hidden beneath a false stone slab, was a vertical shaft barely wide enough to contain a man. The body was still inside skeletal, but clearly positioned with arms at the side back, straight, as if he'd been forced into a coffin of stone and sealed there. In his hands rested an open Bible, pages fused to the bone. The name burned into the leather cover: Reverend Malachi Sutter. Pastor Ellery staggered backward, one hand to his chest. Sutter was the first preacher of New Bethany. He was said to have moved to Missouri. Rebecca's voice was quiet but steady. He preached against the pact. Said stolen blood could never build sacred ground. Rachel added, so they made him part of it. News traveled quickly. By the following evening, 6 more riders arrived from Lexington bearing orders from the Kentucky Territorial Court. The church was officially declared a crime scene. No one was allowed in or out of New Bethany until full accounting could be made. Most residents locked themselves in their homes. A few fled into the woods, but the twins remained at the center of it all, never claiming credit, never asking questions, only watching. That night, as the marshals cataloged the remains under lamplight, Rachel turned to her father. "They're quieter now." Elias Monroe tucked a blanket around her shoulders. "Who the men?" she said. "The ones beneath the floor." Rebecca nodded, but the ground still remembers. At midnight, Pastor Ellery walked alone to the church one last time. He sat in the front pew, staring at the empty altar. The church no longer felt like a house of God. It felt like a sealed vault, a place where souls had cried out for years unheard. He prayed, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Why had no one ever spoken? Why had so many agreed to bury the truth? The answer came not from heaven, but from memory. From something he once heard Elder Thatcher say: a lie told by many becomes easier to live with than truth held by one. Outside, as the wind shifted through the pines, the twins stood beneath the full moon. Rachel leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. "It's not finished," she whispered. Rebecca didn't ask why. She already knew. On the third day of the investigation, the town began to fracture. It started with Elder Thatcher. Once the most respected man in New Bethany, keeper of scripture, judge of disputes, bearer of tradition, he was now found wandering the edge of town, muttering prayers that made no sense. "He's speaking in circles," whispered Martha Carter as she watched him pace. "Something's broken in him." But Elias Monroe disagreed. "No," he said softly, "it's not broken, it's finally surfacing." That night, Thatcher was found in the sanctuary, curled at the base of the pulpit, weeping into the boards that had hidden the bones. He was cradling something wrapped in oilcloth. The marshals unwrapped it carefully. It was a blood-stained ledger, different from the church records, older. Inside were 17 names, not of victims, but of those who had voted to begin the killings. Each name signed under a heading written in trembling ink, "The Pact, 1812. Elder Thatcher's name was third. The last entry unsigned had been left blank, a space, as if waiting. Thomas Creed held up the book in front of the townspeople the next morning. No one denied its authenticity. Only one person spoke, Rebecca. "There are 2 names missing," she said. The crowd stiffened. Creed frowned. 2 Rachel stepped beside her sister. The ones who didn't vote, but who helped dig, who helped bury. Rebecca pointed directly at Martha Carter. "You washed the altar stone. You said it was wine." Martha blanched. "You were only a child," someone murmured. But Martha didn't speak. Her hands trembled at her sides. Creed stepped toward her. "Is this true?" She turned and ran. They found her the next day hanging in the rafters of her barn. A note clutched in her fist, ink soaked through from the storm. "I was 13. I carried water and soap. I thought it was holy work until I heard the crying. I never spoke. I am speaking now." She was buried far from the others, no sermon, no hymn, but the twins placed a single wildflower on her grave. She heard Rachel whispered, but she didn't listen. Rebecca finished. The deaths didn't stop with Martha. Within a week, 2 others had vanished into the forest. Both elders, both known to be part of the founding families. One was found dead beside the creek, the other never surfaced at all. At first, the town suspected guilt. Then they began to suspect something worse. Their being called, Elias whispered to Ellery, by who, by the ground. Meanwhile, the federal team began unearthing documents from beneath the church crypt and old meeting hall. Letters, confessions, maps of shallow graves that extended beyond church walls, out into the fields behind the boarding house, even near the children's school. They had thought the crime was 13 men. They were wrong. It was systemic, a culture, a doctrine twisted into silence. That's when Rachel stopped eating. She sat by the window each day staring into the pines. Elias tried speaking to her, reading from scripture, offering music. Nothing stirred her. One night, Rebecca finally explained, she hears them walking now. All of them, not just the men under the church. Elias froze. Then, who Rebecca turned her eyes to the floor. The ones nobody wrote about. The ones who weren't white. Creed's team returned to the archives in Lexington and confirmed it. Between 1812 and 1820, more than 30 freedmen and travelers of color had passed through the New Bethany corridor, escaping slave catchers seeking northern land or simply passing west. None were recorded leaving. None were recorded buried. They simply ceased to exist. The town records never mentioned them. But the ledger didn't lie. In a separate envelope marked discarded pages were names in a different hand. One stood out. Samuel Diggs, freedman, built the stone walls. Last seen July 4th, 1815. Rachel whispered that name in her sleep. Creed decided to dig near the wall foundations the next morning. What they found would redefine the case entirely. Because what lay beneath that wall was not just one man. It was a trench containing the skeletal remains of at least 9 people. Men, women, children, all packed into shallow graves beneath the foundation of what had been the schoolhouse. Their bones told stories, broken ribs, crushed skulls, hands still bound. Rebecca touched the stones and wept for the first time since arriving. They taught children on top of them, she sobbed. Rachel sat beside her and whispered, were not the first girls to know too much. The schoolhouse in New Bethany had always been a place of uneasy silence. The boards creaked too much. The windows never stayed clean. Children complained of shadows that didn't belong to people, of voices that whispered from beneath the floor when it rained. But now the digging began, and the soil itself started to speak. Marshal Creed's team unearthed 11 bodies from beneath the old foundation. 4 were adult women. 3 were men, likely laborers. The remaining 4 children. 1 still had a rusted tin rattle tucked under a broken rib cage. Another had its small arms wrapped protectively around the smaller bones of a sibling. They had not died of plague. They had been bound, bludgeoned, buried in haste, and the worst part, a strip of torn cloth clung to one of the adult skeletons, a teaching sash embroidered faintly with the name Miss Honora Black. She had been recorded in church journals as a schoolteacher from New York who came south in 1816 to educate the mountain children in charity and letters. The journals said she left in 1817 due to illness. That was a lie. Rachel refused to enter the schoolhouse once the digging began. She said it smelled like burnt wood and milk turned sour. Rebecca, on the other hand, began standing in the doorway for hours. "She's listening," Elias whispered one evening, to what Ellery asked. Elias glanced at the shadows twisting against the far wall, to what's still trying to leave. That night, Rebecca sat upright in bed and began reciting multiplication tables, flawlessly. Then she switched to scripture, then to nursery rhymes, in a voice that was not her own. 4 times 4 is 16. Miss Black says silence is golden. Our Father who art in heaven, don't let them find the hole behind the bookshelf. She didn't remember any of it the next morning, but the marshals searched the school anyway. Behind a bookshelf in the corner they found a hidden compartment. Inside there were 4 objects: a blood-stained switch, a tiny book of psalms, a handful of buttons, and a folded piece of parchment torn and smudged with the words, "They sing when they're scared. They sing when they're dying." Creed sat beside Ellery that evening in the rectory, staring at the objects laid out on the table. This town, he said flatly, was built on bones and lullabies. Ellery didn't respond. He was watching Rebecca from the window where she now stood perfectly still, whispering something to the empty yard. That night, Rachel screamed in her sleep. Elias ran into the room. She was sweating, eyes wide pointing toward the corner. "He was here," she gasped. "The man with the cane, the one who made them dig." Elias knelt. "What man?" She looked at him and whispered, "The one the church still calls holy." Later that night, Ellery sat alone in the sanctuary holding a photo taken from the church archives. It showed the founding elders: Silas Gray, Jonah Thatcher, Ezra Miller, and in the center, a tall man with sunken eyes and a dark cane, Reverend Malachi Sutter. But Ellery now knew the timeline didn't match. Sutter hadn't been the first pastor. He had come after the pact, after the murders began, after the silences were cemented. So why was he in the earliest photo? Ellery flipped the image over. A note, scrawled on the back in ink, so faded it barely clung to the parchment: "Our spiritual steward come from the east. He speaks with fire, he shall never die." The next morning, Rebecca drew a picture. She didn't say a word, just slid it across the table to Ellery and walked away. It showed the inside of the schoolhouse children on benches, a woman at the front, and beneath the floor, rows of faces, all with open mouths, all looking up. One figure stood over them with a cane and no eyes, and in the corner of the drawing, scrawled in tight cursive, he fed them lies until they slept forever. The marshals sealed the schoolhouse by dusk. They placed guards at the church. Half the townsfolk had fled into the woods or moved towards neighboring valleys, but Ellery knew it wasn't enough. Not when the girls were still dreaming, not when they weren't alone in their own minds anymore. That night, Elias found Rebecca staring at the mirror in her room, not looking into it, talking to it. He asked her what she saw. She turned to him, face pale and eyes glassy. She says, "We weren't the first, but maybe we'll be the last." "Who?" Elias whispered. Rebecca smiled faintly. Miss Black. She's still teaching, but only the ones who listen in the dark. Rachel had always spoken in riddles when frightened. But since the schoolhouse was unearthed, her words had taken on the weight of testimony. He drags his cane across the stones, she whispered to Ellery one evening. It makes sparks that scream. Ellery hesitated. Who Rachel's eyes fluttered. The one who asked them to sing, while they were burying. Rebecca had stopped speaking entirely. She now drew constantly, her small hands smudged with charcoal. Dozens of images appeared under her touch, a circle of men holding torches in a church basement, a child bound at the wrists facing the altar, a tree on fire with bodies hanging like fruit, and again, the man with the cane, always tall, always smiling. His eyes were never drawn. Only black sockets leaking smoke. Creed called in reinforcements. We're past local tragedy, he told his superior. This is a systemic ritual operation disguised under religion. He received approval for a full excavation of the rectory cellar where Reverend Sutter once lived for over 2 decades. The entrance to the cellar was hidden behind a false wall in the pastor's quarters. It hadn't been opened in nearly 40 years. The air was immediately sour sulfur ash, rotting leather. By lantern light they descended. The stairs ended in a stone chamber roughly 10 feet wide. At the far wall was a wooden chair blackened with burn marks. On the seat a coil of rope, bloodstained. Beside it an iron rod. A twisted walking cane, its handle carved into a crude crucifix. Above the chair, etched into the stone confession, is purification. Pain is the fire of truth. Creed muttered, This isn't theology. This is doctrine turned into torture. Ellery stepped forward, handshaking. He called it the room of refinement. I thought it was metaphor. In the far corner, a stone shelf held a stack of ledgers and hymnals, some charred, others wrapped in fabric. Inside one volume was a folded piece of parchment titled Litany of the Cleaned. It listed names, dozens. Next to each a symbol, either a sun or a knife. Creed counted 87 names. Elias sat with Rachel that night, gently reading from the names found in the cellar. He paused when Rachel gasped. She pointed to one name, Honora Black. She screamed when they made her sing, Rachel whispered. They said she was filled with the devil, but she only wanted to leave. Then she began humming a slow, broken melody. It wasn't one Elias recognized. But Ellery, standing in the doorway, paled. That's the original communion hymn, he said. But it's in the wrong key. It's fractured. Rebecca didn't sleep. At sunrise, she presented a new drawing to Creed. This one was more detailed, almost architectural. It showed the rectory, the church, and beneath them a spiral staircase going down and down, ending in a pit surrounded by symbols, knife, flame, cross-eye. Creed stared at it, stunned. Where did you see this? Rebecca's eyes didn't blink. He showed me. Said the bottom is where truth burns clean. Against protocol, Creed ordered a second dig beneath the church's eastern wall, exactly where Rebecca's drawing indicated. Within hours, they found the top of a spiral staircase carved into ancient stone. It hadn't been used in decades. Blood had dried in the cracks, and at the bottom, a blackened chamber circular with soot-charred walls and strange symbols etched by hand. At the center was a stone altar. On it, a human jawbone scorched, and scrawled on the back wall in faint reddish ink, the body is deceitful. The soul can be reshaped. God does not want the impure. Ellery turned away, trembling. Creed looked at him. This isn't revival. This is extermination with liturgy. That evening, thunder rolled in from the north. Rebecca stood by the church door and whispered, He's coming. Rachel added, He's already here. The storm arrived like judgment. Thunder cracked over the mountains, shaking window panes and splintering branches. Inside the church, candles flickered and hissed. Even the oil lamps dimmed as if air itself was being pulled inward. Rebecca sat in the center aisle, knees tucked beneath her, staring at the altar. She hasn't moved in over an hour, Ellery whispered. Creed nodded grimly. She's waiting for something. Elias had taken Rachel upstairs when she began muttering verses backward. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. Pastures green in me maketh he. When he asked who taught her, she replied, The man in the wall. That night, the remaining townspeople, only 35 of them, now gathered for what was meant to be prayer. But when Ellery stood at the pulpit, his voice failed. Not from fear, but from something else. Something pressing down on the sanctuary thick as smoke. Then Rebecca stood up and walked forward. She climbed the steps to the pulpit and faced the congregation. She began to speak in a voice not her own. You burned them for believing wrong. You drowned them for singing in the dark. You called it mercy, but it was cleansing. Creed reached for her gently. Rebecca turned, looked into his eyes, and suddenly screamed, "Don't touch me," with hands that didn't dig. The wind outside roared, as if in response, and then the organ began to play. No one was seated at it. The keys moved on their own. The melody was familiar to Ellery, an ancient hymn never recorded but whispered in old sermons, a fire song. Rebecca turned back to the crowd. He walked these aisles in boots of ash. He struck boys with canes until they prayed in tongues. He made women bleed until they saw angels. He said, "Pain is proof you are listening." In the balcony, Rachel sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to Elias. "He's here," she choked. "He's behind the altar. He's smiling." The candles blew out all at once. Darkness fell like a curtain. Then the bell rang. 3 times, but no one had touched the rope. Creed pulled his pistol and stepped toward the altar. As lightning flashed through the stained-glass windows, they all saw it a shadow behind the pulpit. Tall, lean, holding something that scraped stone. It vanished when the light faded. Elias grabbed both girls and led them out into the storm. Creed followed, barking orders for everyone to evacuate. But as they exited, the flames began. Not from outside, but from within the church floorboards. The fire climbed slowly, methodically, without smoke. It danced along the aisle like fingers. And in the flames they swore they heard voices. Not screams, not howls, but singing. Children's voices, a broken choir. The church burned for 7 hours. The rain didn't touch it. At dawn, the structure collapsed inward, leaving only stone and cinder. The altar had blackened, but the center of the sanctuary where Rebecca had stood remained untouched. Only one thing was found there. A wooden cane, burned at one end, but still standing upright in the ash. Balanced, waiting. The townspeople who remained packed their things that morning. Some didn't speak again. Others refused to ever say the name New Bethany aloud. Elias sat with Rachel and Rebecca in the boarding house parlor. They were quiet, calm, but their drawings had changed. Now they drew only blank faces, figures without eyes, ears, or mouths. "They don't need to speak anymore," Rachel whispered. They said the fire did the talking. Ellery resigned from his post the next day. He left his collar behind and walked north alone, vowing to never step foot in Kentucky again. Creed remained. He had one last excavation planned. The pit beneath the altar had not been fully searched. He ordered it opened the following week. What they found at the bottom of the shaft would be sealed by federal order, never disclosed to public record. But one photograph remains locked in the archives. It shows the carved stone base of the pit, surrounded by 13 sets of initials, and in the center, "Let what we bury stay forgotten, lest it return louder." Some believe it was a final warning. Others think it was a promise. 3 weeks after the fire, Marshal Creed received a letter. It came from Boone County, signed by a woman named Esther Lyle, age 81. Inside was a trembling line of ink, "I was one of them. I remember the cane. I remember the hymn. I will speak if someone listens." Creed went alone. Esther lived in a crooked cabin at the edge of the woods, surrounded by wind chimes and wilted roses. Her eyes were clouded by age, but not by time. When she looked at Creed, she said he didn't preach the gospel. He preached fear. Esther had arrived in New Bethany as a child in 1827. Her mother, widowed and poor, had believed the promises free schooling, warm beds, moral instruction. Instead, Esther was placed in a dormitory where doors locked from the outside. They were made to memorize the fire sermon, not the Bible. They were punished with silence. No laughter, no singing outside of hymns. And every Sunday they were taken beneath the church to the stone room. He would choose one, Esther whispered. They said it was for purification, but it was punishment, and no one came back the same. Her eyes flicked to the window. They said Reverend Sutter never slept, that he walked the halls with fire in his blood. Esther reached for Creed's hand. But he wasn't the worst part. Creed blinked. What was? She leaned close. The women who watched, the ones who smiled when the cane fell, they called themselves the cleaners. She paused. Some of them were our own mothers. Creed left with a tape recording 3 fragile drawings and Esther's final note. He said when the Wright twins arrived, the veil would burn through, and the song would end. Back in New Bethany, Rachel began coughing blood. Rebecca no longer drew, she simply sat with her eyes wide open, whispering words that made no sense to Elias, but matched the old sermons in Sutter's lost hymnals. They were finishing something. But what Elias pleaded with Creed, we need to take them far away, out of the valley, out of the state. Creed shook his head. It won't matter. This thing didn't start in New Bethany. It's older than the dirt it stands on. Ellery's final letter arrived a day later. Written from Ohio, it said, I've come to believe we were never the caretakers of the truth. We were the jailers of something far worse. The twins didn't awaken it. They were born because of it. And now the fire has memory. The girls stopped eating, they stopped sleeping, but their bodies didn't weaken. Instead, they began speaking in unison only when no one was in the room. One deputy reported hearing them say, he's not gone. He just changed clothes. On the 6th night after the fire, Rachel stood in the ruins of the church at midnight. Rebecca followed. Elias chased after them, lantern in hand. In the center of the ash, the cane still stood upright, untouched by weather or flame. The girls knelt before it and began to sing. But the melody wasn't of this world. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't terrifying. It was familiar. It was the same lullaby Esther Lyle had hummed in her sleep every night for 74 years. Elias fell to his knees, not from fear, not from faith, but from the unshakable realization they weren't finishing the ritual. They were undoing it. With every note, with every whispered verse, the bones beneath New Bethany remembered. The silence lifted. The fire dimmed. The veil tore. At dawn, the cane finally cracked in half. The twins collapsed, but they were still breathing. Rachel opened her eyes and whispered, they're gone now. The song is done. Marshal Creed filed his final report 1 week later. It was classified, but a copy remains in a sealed archive marked Case Closed, Unexplained Phenomena, June 1834. Subject: Ritual. Harm, religious manipulation, manifestation. New Bethany was abandoned by winter. The land was declared geologically unstable. No one was permitted to build on it again. But sometimes when storms gather over the mountains, locals say you can hear faint voices in the wind, not crying, not chanting, just singing.